Pope Francis is saying there's a certain type of youth that actually scares him. Join us with the latest from the Eternal City, Church Militan's Rome correspondent, Dr. Jules Gomes. Jules, Pope Francis once again attacking priests and seminarians who know, love, and live their faith. Tell us about it.
Brad, Pope Francis has set a new record in papal verbosity while he was in Portugal for the World Youth Day. The Spanish liberal media company Vida Nueva, or New Life, published an extensive interview with Pope Francis, and Pope Francis basically said in this interview, he said, we need normal men going into seminary who will go and kick a ball and play soccer and not go to neighborhoods to dogmatize.
Well, you know, he actually used the word dangerous, and he said scared. So who are these young folks that scare him so much, and what makes them, according to him, so dangerous?
Well, let me read for you. These young men are traditionalist Catholics, those backward-looking people who, according to Pope Francis, are rigid. And this interview, by the way, extensively goes into bashing traditionalist priests and seminarians. And Pope Francis is saying that these young men are dangerous because while they may be rigid because of the moral and theological relativism they see around them, there is a deeper problem, and that deeper problem is a moral corruption in their hearts. Now, that's a very, very strong charge to make. On the one hand, he says this rigidity comes from good people who want to serve the Lord. On the other hand, he says this armor of rigidity hides a lot of corruption. And he says behind this traditionalism, we have discovered moral problems and serious vices, double lives. We all know of bishops who, needing priests, have made use of people they had thrown out of other seminaries for immorality. I wonder if he's making reference to Bishop Dominic Ray, the Bishop of Toulon, who has been suspended at the moment because he was so welcoming to traditionalists who were good people, but who have been rejected simply because they are traditionalists in other dioceses.
Now, he was also talking about this attachment to right-wing ideologues that makes them dangerous. What do you have to say about that?
Well, again, he talks about how these right-wing and left-wing, again, does not give examples, ideologues are conditioned by this sort of backward-looking mentality. And he says that there is a need to soften them up, actually uses this term. The solution to this problem is for the training ministers, the people under whom they are, doing an apprenticeship, for example, or a curacy, to soften them up and to drive this out of them, which is, a bit unpastoral, to say the least.
Now, also, just specifically about holy priests, that came up during the interview. What do you have to say about holy priests?
Well, this was probably the most insulting statement that he made in this interview. He called them blessed imeldas. Now, we know that Blessed Imelda was she died when she was 11. She was an Italian little girl from Bologna, and Pope Pius X declared her to be the protectoress or patroness of children wanting to make their first Holy Communion. So she's regarded as the patroness of a fervent and a genuine first Holy Communion. And for Pope Francis to so dismissively, compare these priests to Blessed Imelda, or Blessed Imelda to these priests, again, is something that it was totally uncalled for.
Then maybe their devotion to the Blessed Sacrament, which they're serving at the altar, our Lord Jesus Christ. Seems like the church now is being filled with what's been called and has been called for decades now, rigid priests, seminarians who went on to become priests. What does Pope Francis propose as a remedy for them?
Well, basically, they need to be detoxified of their rigidity. And one solution to this is to change the seminary training. Seminaries should not be ideological kitchens, Pope Francis says. Also, he mentioned something very interesting. If there are smaller seminaries with, 5 or 10 seminarians there, they should be dismantled, and these people should be put together in larger seminaries. And we know what that means, because traditionalist seminaries sometimes tend to be smaller, or in traditionalist communities, and these communities need to be dismantled so training can be more controlled and regulated, and of course the sort of training that he wants to pump in ideologically can be facilitated. Now,
he said also something about humanistic formation. Could you make heads or tails of that?
No, honestly, I couldn't, because, a priest is trained in 3 years of philosophy in many cases and 4 years of theology. Already, priests do receive a fair amount of quote-unquote humanistic training. I don't know if he's referring to the humanism of Erasmus. I don't think so. The training in the Greek and Latin primary sources. I don't think he means that at all. What he's probably referring to is more of an exposure to the world. And this, again, is probably a take from his background in a continent, packed with liberation theology and the talk of praxis.
Let's jump to another topic, Jules. Pope Francis also asked in the interview about, does the church need a Vatican III? How do you respond to that?
Well, what he said was it does not need a Vatican III right now, because it has not yet accomplished the reforms of Vatican II. And then he went on to say that these traditionalists forget Vatican II. They are back at Vatican I, and they don't want to budge an inch from their entrenched position in the past in Vatican I. So yeah, that's what he said about Vatican II.
Now, what about synodality, the upcoming, the bishops' synod on synodality, which is just around the corner in October, and looking towards the future next year to bring all this to a close?
Interestingly, he quoted a nun who came up to him and asked him, Holy Father, is the Synod on Synodality going to change doctrine? And, this is what the fear has been among conservatives in the Catholic Church. And Pope Francis, he said, he threw his head back and roared with laughter, and he said, whoever told you that? And he kind of tried to assure her that what he intends to do is to complement what the Eastern Church, particularly the Eastern Orthodox Church, has modeled in terms of its governance for centuries, and that is the model of synodality. According to him, the Western Church has failed to do it. Synodality has become, it practically has ceased to exist in the Western Church, according to him. He thinks that's an ideal model that needs to be revived. He sees the Eastern Orthodox churches doing it ideally, and so he says that he wants to bring this model into the Western Church and see it flourish.
I can't help but think when you say that, Jules, that many bishops would like to give the priests the opportunity to say the traditional Latin Mass, and Pope Francis is like, no, you have to talk to me about that, or use a particular parish church for that. And he would say, oh, you got to talk to Rome about that. So that seems to fly contrary to this whole synodality thing that he's trying to push. And then also back in 2018, when the bishops wanted to actually get to the root of how did McCarrick rise to power, our own U.S. Bishops Conference, and he shut it down. And so that's, once again, flies in the face of this whole synodality that he seems to be pushing. But that's all a sidebar topic, just bouncing around my brain. Jules, let me ask you a question here. Why do you think, just Pope Francis, right or wrong, good or bad, why do you think, it's your gut, why does he seem to not like conservative, traditional, high information, well-formed in the Catholic faith seminarians and priests who stand up for the teachings of the church and aren't afraid to express it in their life?
Precisely because he, like many other people who have bought into a particular reading of Vatican II, think that Vatican II has come up with an entirely new model of the church in terms of ecumenism, for example, or interreligious dialogue, in terms of religious liberty. And in terms of the liturgical reforms, and he sees these traditionalists as rejecting Vatican II wholesale. Vatican II, for these people, as we know, is the super council, the council that overrides all other ecumenical councils. And he's a bit shocked that, they are so clearly, they seem to be rejecting it. And by doing so, rejecting his agenda, if I can call it that, which is interreligious dialogue, ecumenism, etc., liturgical reform, etc. That is primarily the reason for his vitriolic reaction against traditionalists. There is also a possibility, and we know this in Rome, that there are people who are constantly drip-feeding him with information that goes against traditionalists, putting up certain, bringing before him a certain narrative of what traditionalists are like, stereotypical narrative, and Francis seems to be uncritically buying into this narrative.
That's very good, Jules. Thank you very much for that. Many good men over the past 60 years were branded rigid by their hippie formators while in the seminary, and often had their vocations actually to the priesthood permanently derailed. Yet many seminarians weathered the spiritual storms, clung to their Catholic faith, and managed to get ordained by the grace of God. Hats off to you. You're part of the bright future in store for Holy Mother Church. Jules, thank you so much for your report and for your spot-on insights.
Thank you, Brad.